In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a water material. Specifically, we're going to focus on creating pool or still water using the single layer water shading model. But with a few tweaks and few adjustments, you can expand on this material to create a more versatile, more open-ended water material that can be used for sea and oceans. This is the same material I created to be used for an environment I was working on, infinity tiled rooms and pools. And it's a great material with a lot of customization, so you can change it to make it look how you want it for your environment. So I'm going to cover the entire process from very beginning to the end of how to create this water material. If you don't want to go through and create this material yourself, you can actually pick it up and download it by becoming a supporter on WOLD Patreon, and I'll provide this material for you to use right away. So with that, let's go ahead and begin with the tutorial. I'm going to use this small environment, this room that I created using the Infinity Tiled Rooms and Pools modular asset pack. And it's going to be perfect for us to create this water material. This room does not have any exterior lights shining in, so no directional light, no exterior lights, and everything is lit with either rectangular lights or some point lights. I'm going to mention the directional light and an issue that you may experience whenever you're using a single layer water shader, but we'll talk about that towards the end of the video. So before we create the material, you need a flat plane. This is where you're going to apply your material, or more accurately, the material instance we're going to create. If you don't have an existing plane to use, you can go to Place Actors panel, go to Shapes, and use this plane as your water plane. So let's go ahead and just drag this right away. This is where the water is going to appear when we have the material instance. So I'm gonna place it and let's scale it. I'm gonna scale it to fill this area where the water is going to appear. So I'm gonna make it larger, and you do not have to keep this uniform. Just fill in the gap where the water will appear. Or if you want to, you could keep it uniform. It doesn't really matter. Our material will work on this plane just fine. And here we go. This is where the water is going to go. Now let's begin to create our material. Find a folder where you want to create your material in. So I'm going to go into an existing folder I have, WOLD Tutorials, and then go into the materials folder, and this is where I'm going to create this material. I'm going to right click an empty space and create a new material, and I'm going to name it m_water_pool. And let's open it up. The very first thing you want to do is select the main node, and then go into the details panel. We're going to change the shading model from default lit to single layer water. And then we need a node that controls the shading of that water. Right click on empty space and search for single layer water material output and insert it. And this is the node that's going to drive some important parameters and properties for how that water will appear. So first we're going to focus on scattering coefficient and absorption coefficient. Now by themselves, they don't make any sense. But simply, scattering coefficient is the water color depth and its amount, or the intensity. And absorption coefficient is the surface color of the water. Or more accurately, it's the color that gets absorbed by the water to produce the opposite water. So essentially water absorbs color and then reflects back the color of the water. And the color that the water tends to absorb is red and orange. So absorption coefficient is the color that gets absorbed to show you the blue or the green color of the water. Now don't let these two confuse you, because we're going to set this up in a way that's going to make it easier for you to use, and you know exactly what you're doing when you're controlling it through a parameter. So first, let's create the surface color of the water. That's the main property that we need to deal with. And this is absorption coefficient. So hold 3 in the keyboard and left click. This will insert a constant 3 vector. This is going to be the color of the water. Right click and convert it to a parameter. We're going to be converting a lot of things to a parameter so we can control it inside the material instance. Let's rename this water color. Then we need an intensity amount. Hold 1, left click to insert a constant 1 vector. Right click and let's convert to a parameter. This is going to be water color intensity. And then let's multiply this. Hold M and left click. We're going to insert a few more nodes in between to make this value easier to change, but let's just stick with the basics first before we insert a few additional nodes. And then let's connect everything up. Watercolor constant 3 vector will go into multiply A, watercolor intensity will go into multiply B, and then multiply will go into absorption coefficient. Before we can successfully prototype this and test this, we need a few more values inside the main node itself. So we need a base color, which is going to be set to 0, no base colors. So I'm going to hold down 1, left click for constant 1 vector and leave it at 0 that's going to be connected to base color, and leave it at that. Then we need a few parameters for roughness and for opacity. And instead of holding down 1 for a constant 1 vector and then turn it into a parameter, I'm going to hold down S and left click. This inserts a scalar node, which is a constant 1 vector converted to a parameter. So it just saves me a few clicks. And for this, I will name it roughness. I'm going to leave it at 0 and connect it into a roughness input. I'm going to make a duplicate of this, select it, Control D to duplicate, and rename this to opacity. And this is going to be our water opacity. And I'm going to set the default value to 0.5, halfway in between. And then we can adjust it and connect this output into opacity node. All right, so you can see we have a water-like effect. It's actually more like glass because it's not moving, but we are getting our opacity. We have reflections or roughness, and we have a very basic watercolor that we'll be able to choose. So let's go ahead and hit apply and begin to test this out to see what we have. Let's create a material instance from our water material. I'm gonna right click and choose create material instance, and I will leave the name as, actually I'm gonna replace it. I'm gonna name it MI water pool, and I'll leave the postfix at the end as instance. And then I'm gonna take this instance and apply it to our water plane. Here we are. We have a very basic non-moving water. Let's open up the material instance. And let me make this smaller so we can see the water and the material instance properties. Let's enable watercolor and watercolor intensity. These are the two values you want to control right now. So the way watercolor works, it's actually not the watercolor, but the opposite the watercolor has to be. Because this absorption coefficient means what color is being absorbed by the water. For the watercolor right now, so it will be a lot easier to use, we need to choose an opposite color on the color wheel to get the color you want. So if you want your water to be teal or blue, you need to choose the opposite color because it's absorbing the opposite color to reveal the watercolor. Now you won't see any effect is because we need to adjust the intensity of the watercolor. So I'm going to choose this red orange first, and then I'm going to turn up the watercolor intensity. Now this value is very sensitive. So if I go up, it will begin to change, but we're going to insert a node that kind of controls this value to make it a little bit easier to use. So I'm going to put in 0.1 right now. And you can see we are absorbing orange, red, and it's giving us the opposite color. If you want something else, you have to choose that color, the opposite of it, in order for that color to be absorbed, in order to give you the color you want. Again, this value is extremely sensitive, so I'm going to put it down even lower, 0.01. And now we're getting that teal color, which is again opposite of the red color that's being absorbed by the water. Let's fix this really quick so we can change the value that's a little bit more friendly than having those small decimals. So let me close this. Let's go back to the material and let me move this out of the way. So to get a more friendly value for us to adjust the watercolor intensity, we need a divide node, and we need to divide this value by a large number. So I'm going to hold down D, left click to insert a divide node. We're going to take the watercolor intensity, plug it into divide A, and then we need a value for B. And I'm not going to input any value here. I'm just going to enter the value into the divide itself. And we're going to divide this by 1000. So this will allow us to input a more friendlier, more easy to use value for the watercolor intensity. And then let's take the output into multiply B. Let's hit apply. And actually before this, let's set up a default amount. Let's input 3. So we have some color show up right away. And actually no color will show up because we don't have a default watercolor, but let's just input something so we don't have to adjust it all the way from 0. Let's hit apply and let's bring back the material instance and let me reset this. Now you can use this a little bit better and you have whole values and it's not that sensitive. So with a value of maybe 3 or 4, we're getting that teal color, which is again opposite on the color wheel. So if I wanted my water to be red for some reason, I would choose the blue and the teal. Again, it's getting absorbed, so it's showing us the opposite. All right, so let's make an adjustment where we choose the color we want, and that's what shows up instead of having to choose the opposite. Just making things easier to work with inside the material instance. So let's go back to our material. And to do this, we need a node called hue shift. So let's go ahead and come over here to the watercolor. Let's move this down and right click in the empty space and search for hue shift. So we're gonna shift the hue on the color wheel half the amount so it picks the opposite color. So to do this, we need a constant 1 vector. Hold down 1 and left click, and we're going to input 0.5. So this constant 1 vector, our value of 0.5, half the amount, we're going to hue shift percentage. Then we're going to take our watercolor, we'll go into texture input, and then the output of this hue shift will go into multiply. like so. So now when we choose the absorption color, the 0.5 value will take that little slider and point opposite of the color wheel, choosing the color we want. Let's test, hit apply, and you can already see it's working. So if I choose any color, it will choose that color to be as a watercolor. So now I can choose the teal that I want or whatever color I need and then adjust my intensity, the watercolor intensity. And you can see it is working. We then have opacity and roughness. So I'm not going to touch roughness. Roughness will control how shiny or how dull our water surface will be. For this, you should want to leave it at 0. There may be times and instances, depending on the water type, that you may need to adjust this. But for us, I'm going to leave it at its default value of 0. I'm not going to touch roughness, but you do have controls for roughness here. And then you have controls for opacity. So at 0.5, the opacity of the water is halfway. If you turn it down, it's going to be less opacity. So perfect for pool water because it's very clean and you can see it at the bottom. Or you can turn this all the way up to, let's say 1, and you have removed the opacity and we're just seeing the reflection. So you have controls now to adjust the opacity of the water to depending on what you want. Let's go ahead and just set it to 0.5. We'll adjust it when we need it. All right, our water material is coming along. Next we need is this value right here, scattering coefficient. This is the color and the intensity of water depth. So absorption coefficient is the surface color of the water. Scattering coefficient is the depth, intensity, and color. So you will have two values to play around with to create more realistic water. Let's go ahead and organize this. I'm going to move this down. And we will also organize this more into groups, so it's a lot easier to work with material instances here, but we'll do that a little later. Let's focus on scattering coefficient first. Let's insert a constant 3 vector again, hold 3 and left click, convert this to a parameter, and we're going to name this water scattering depth color. And I'm going to leave it at default of black, but we'll be able to change it inside the material instance. We'll then need the intensity amount. Hold down S and left click to create a scalar parameter and name it water scattering depth intensity. And we can also set a default value. Let's just choose 1. We then need a divide and a multiply. So again, let me move this down a little bit more, like so. So we need a multiply to multiply these two, but then we also need to tone down this number. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a divide right away. Hold D and left click. Take the output of intensity, connect it into divide A. Divide B will receive a value, and let's do also 1000. We then need a multiply. Hold M, left click. Take the RGB of water scattering depth color, go into multiply A. Divide output will go into multiply B. And now we can go ahead and connect this multiply to go into scattering coefficient. And let's hit apply and we're going to test. Let's bring back a material instance and let's enable the water scattering depth and then the amount. And then let's increase the water scattering intensity so we can see the effect. All right, it's not going to be very noticeable, not very much. It's because we need to change the water scattering depth color. So right now it's black, but once you begin to change, or let's choose a color instead. And usually it's going to be the similar color or same color as the watercolor. However, just for the effect of it, let me choose red. So at certain depth limit, this water, the way this works, the way the shader works is when you begin to raise it up and you have depth in the water, you can see that it changes that depth color. The more shallow, the less of that color will show up, the depth color. But the more depth you have, the depth color will begin to appear. And that's controlled by water scattering depth color. So you can kind of see that red show through. Let's increase the intensity of it. Let's go even higher. And you can see that it's beginning to mix with the teal watercolor. So this is why we're getting that blue purplish colors, because the red is mixing with the green, with the teal, and producing that color. So the higher you go, you can see that effect take place. So if I choose anything else, you can kind of begin to see that depth color a lot more noticeable. Now, of course, we don't want these crazy colors, so we need to choose a more regular, normal color, which is going to be similar color, maybe a little bit darker of our water surface color, something like that. The amount right now is way too intense. I just kind of amplified it for the effect. Let's bring it back down. Actually, let's reset it to a more manageable number. Let me bring this back down, the plane, like so. And let's increase. You can see the water is kind of getting a little bit murkier. Let me maximize this view. So if I lower the opacity, let's go 0.2, and then control the intensity, the depth intensity. You can see that if I lower this, we can see the bottom color, the depth color. I can control that depth color a little bit more. It's not going to be noticeable. Let me bump this value up a little bit. And the higher I go, a little bit murkier and darker it gets. So now you have two values. You have the water scattering depth intensity, and then you have the color of that depth intensity. So you will have both of these values for each, for the surface watercolor and intensity, as well as the depth watercolor and its intensity to control. All right, so now let's go ahead and organize these four values together into a group because they work off of each other and you'll be adjusting all four at the same time. Let's go back to our material and let me organize this first by selecting them all the nodes, hit C for comment, and this is going to be our watercolor. And every single one of these parameters that we have will go into watercolor group. So let me go ahead and select all the parameters that we have, and it's 4 here. And then under group, assign them to a new group called watercolor. Let's hit apply, and here's what it's going to look like. Watercolor, and we have watercolor, then intensity, then scattering, depth color, and its intensity. Nicely organized for you to control and tweak. And then for these two parameters, for roughness and opacity, let's assign a general group. So select them both, go to group, and name them general. Let's hit apply, and here's what we have. Next up are the waves, the ripples, and the water motion. For this, we need a normal map. So you could create and import your own. However, Unreal Engine has a few that you can use. So let's go back to Content Browser, and the first one will be found inside Starter Content if you have this added into your project. And if you search for water, there'll be a texture called T, water, and you can use this as your normal map for ripples and waves. However, there is a better version of this that I like to use, and it's a good starting point and will produce very good results. You have to go to settings inside the content browser and enable engine content. Then select engine content folder, and here's the normal map that we are going to use. So let's go ahead and grab it, and I'm going to drag it into the material editor. And we're going to use this as our normal map. Let me go ahead and create a bit more space. I'm going to move this up. And to get things going, let's just go ahead and plug the RGB of our normal map into the normal map input. We're going to set this up with a lot more functionality and controls, but yeah, I just want to plug this in and let's see how this looks. So you can see it already makes the water far better. Now, of course, there's no movement here. It's just still water and the normal map doing its work. But you can now see the water surface begin to break using the normal map. So first, let's set up ability to control tiling. Depending on how large the plane is, you want to be able to control the tiling of this texture on top of that water plane. So let's set that up. We're going to use world align position. Let's search for it. Right click on empty space and search for world position. This one right here. Absolute world position. This will allow the material to be aligned to the world to achieve a seamless, consistent appearance regardless of the mesh scale, rotation, or position. And it uses the world position to map the texture rather than the mesh's UVs. Now we still need to have the ability to tile this so we can control how much of the repetition we have of this normal map, depending on how much of the scale we want of this normal map. So for this, we're going to insert a scalar parameter, S, and left click, and let's name it water tiling. And then we need a divide node. Divide will allow us to have more reasonable numbers to use for the water tiling, instead of going into the decimals if you use multiply. So let's insert a divide, connect absolute world position, and we're going to use X and Y because we are mapping this texture on a flat plane and we don't have any depth. So we want to map it in world position on X and Y only. Then let's take the water tiling. This will go into divide B, and this value, the default value, let's increase it to a large number. We're going to use 1000. And then let's take divide and go into texture UV's input. Now let's hit apply and take a look. If we take a look at our water tiling, turn this on, and then when you begin to change, you can see the tiling changes depending on what you would want for your level. And if you begin to move this plane, you can see that the position of this plane in the world does not matter. The texture is being projected on top of this water plane in world position, in world space, rather than the UVs of this mesh. Alright, so we have our normal map and we have our controls for tiling, but then we need to have movement and ripples and waves on this plane. We need this water to behave like water. So let's go back into our material, and before we add in the movement, let me select the water tiling and place it into the general category. To make water movement, we need a node called Panner, and we're actually going to have the same setup twice for the normal map. It will move one direction and then we'll move another direction. This will make the water appear still in one place and you'll have more control of the water movement. in empty space, let's search for panner, insert it, then take the divide and connect it into panner coordinate, and then panner, the output will go into the UVs of the texture sample. Instead of controlling the speed of this using these values, we want to have these as a parameter. So we need two parameters. So let's hold down S, left click, and name this one texture panning on X, and let's duplicate it, and this will be texture panning on Y. We're going to make a small adjustment to the name when we have a second copy of these, but let's just work with these first. Let's give a default value to this. So let's just put in 1 at the moment. And then we need to connect both of these into the speed input. Now, to have both of these work, we need to have an append node. This will basically combine the X and the Y together in order for us to connect it into the speed input so we can control the X and Y. So we kind of split these up, but now we need to combine them together so the speed can be read from both of these nodes. And the way that's done is using the append node. So search for append and insert this append vector and connect it. X will go into A, Y will go into B, and the output will go into speed. And let's go ahead and hit apply and take a look. Let's hit Control R, so real time is off, and you can see the water is moving one direction. Now, we can control this, of course, by enabling both of these and going to a lower value. Let's do 0.1, 0.1. So the water is now flowing in one direction at a very low speed. We actually want to have very low speed, something like 0.05 maybe, or even lower than that for pool water. Yeah, we'll go even lower, but you have controls here. Let's go ahead and reset this. And we're gonna actually set up default values first before we mess around with the texture panning inside the material instance. So let's go back to the material and let's make these values a lot smaller. So for the first value, I'm gonna do 0.005, and for the second value, also 0.005. Very low amounts. So let's take a look. Control R, and it's still going fast. That's because I need to reset these back to default to whatever we have now as part of the material. And you can see water is moving a lot slower, so that's what we want. Now the problem is, of course, it's going one single direction. So for still water, for pool water, we need to push the movement opposite direction. So we need to go ahead and set up a second motion that will go the opposite direction. So select your normal map, your panner, your append, and the two controls, and duplicate it right over here. Take the divide from absolute world position and water tiling and connect it to panner coordinate for the second one. But before we move on, we need to change our parameters for the second motion to flow the opposite direction. So for texture X and Y, we need to change the name first. So because we have two controls now, which will be flowing positive way and then flowing negative, we need to reassign some names. So for texture panning, X and Y, I'm going to give a value X1 and Y1. And then for these, I'm going to assign a number 2 at the end, X2 and Y2, like so. And then we need to give a negative value so the water flows the opposite direction for this normal map. So for the second one, I'm going to give a negative 0.005 and a negative for the Y2, same thing. And now we need to take both of these normal maps and combine them together, so they're on top of each other when they are on top of the water plane. And the way to combine normal maps, there is a node called blend angle correct normals. So let's search for blend angle corrected normals right here. So it's going to take two inputs of a normal map, combine them together. So let's take the first one, RGB, will go into base normal. Second one, RGB, will go into additional normal. And the result will be plugged back into normal input. Let's hit apply and take a look at what it's doing now. And now the water is moving in both directions, appearing still, and it actually looks like water. And with these controls that you have now, let's enable all of them. And we have control of how much of that movement we want. You can go ahead and lower this to a very low amount. Let's do 0.2 for all of them. You can vary the numbers. You don't have to keep them the same. Just know that if you go too high in one amount into one direction, then the water will appear like it's flowing into that direction. So that's why I'm keeping these values the same, but you can keep them close enough together and the water will appear still. Just if you go to, let's say 0.5, you can see that water is going to start moving in one direction. So that's why I'm keeping them in a similar amounts, very close together. So here at 0.2, you can see the water is very slow and it's standing still. The problem we have now is the waves are too strong. The intensity of the normal map is too much. It might be good for some water, for like ocean water or sea water, but for a pool water or still water, we need to bring that down. So we need to have controls for this. So let's fix this now. First, before we set this up, let's organize these panning controls by selecting them all and assigning them to a new group called water speed. Alright, now it's much better organized. We have water speed right here on the bottom. Then to bring down the intensity of the normal map, we have a node called flatten normal. And this will flatten the normal using a value, a constant one vector. So let's go ahead and right click, search for flatten normal. Let's insert it. And we need a scalar parameter, S, left click, and name it normal intensity. Actually, let's name it wave intensity. And with a value of 0, no changes will be made. With a value of 1, it will flatten the normal. So it will work from 0 to full intensity, and 1, no waves, no intensity over the normal map. And anything in between will begin to bring down the normal map. Now you can probably invert this so you have value of 0 to 1, but I'm going to keep it as is and use the 0 as full intensity and 1 as nothing. Just keep that in mind. So I'm going to take wave intensity, plug it into flatness, and then the blend corrected normal, plug it into normal input. And then the flat normal will now be connected into the normal input of the material. And then let's hit apply and take a look what we can do with this. So this is the default. And if I go ahead and enable wave intensity and begin to crank this up, we can kind of turn this down to a more reasonable amount of what it would be seen in a pool. So 0.9 maybe. And now water is appearing very still, like it's supposed to be inside a pool area, but still having movement, still having ripples and waves. Very small amount though. Let's go ahead and organize this very quick again. Let's select the water intensity, and we're going to assign this to a group called, let's do general. All right, our water material is coming along very nicely. We have a lot of controls now. We have controls for intensity of the water, the waves, the color, the amount, the depth. So we have a lot of controls now, and water is behaving exactly how we want it to. However, we're still not done. We still have a few things we need to add in to make this water appear more realistic and correct. Next up, we need refraction right here. So what refraction will do is it will begin to break up the objects below the surface of the water. So right now, if we're looking at this railing right here, you can see that it's straight through, and the water is not distorting the objects below the surface of the water. And it should. When you look at the water below, we should see that distortion happening to all the objects, to the railing, as well as the stairs and everything else below the water surface. And that's what refraction will help us do. It will add more realism to this material. So to add refraction is very simple. Right now, by default, it is disabled. So we need to select the main node and go into the details and search for refraction. And change the refraction method from none. And what we are going to use is pixel normal offset. It will use the normal map to create the refraction distortion. Now, usually you would use index of refraction, but that's going to create a problem with a large surface of water, with our water plane. The physically correct way is to use index of refraction, and the correct physical value for water is 1.33. So let's insert a scalar parameter and name it refraction. And let's do the default value that's recommended is 1.33. And I'm going to show you what it looks like, and we're going to change it and update it to make the water look better. So let me connect this up. Let's hit apply. And also let's assign it to a group really quick. It's going to go under general. And here's what it looks like. It will appear incorrect. It is using the correct value for refraction for water, but the illusion is completely broken. So this is, we're not going to use this because it does not look right. So it is recommended for large bodies of water, for water planes, you use pixel normal offset instead of index of refraction. So let's go back to our material and change this, change the refraction method. Let me select a main node, and we're going to change it to pixel normal offset. And we're going to lower this value right here because at 1.33 that's too much. 1 is going to be no changes. But let's take a look at the result right now, and you can see right here it looks much better. The distortion is a little bit too strong, so we need to update this, and we're going to change the value. The one that I found that works pretty well is 1.05. But since this is a parameter, you can increase it or decrease it. Let's hit apply. And now, if we take a look, we're getting that distortion whenever the waves are moving, the normal map is moving, that distortion is happening, and we are getting that distortion of the objects below the surface of the water. And since now we have a parameter for it, we can go ahead and adjust it. Let's enable it, refraction. And if we need to increase this, let's go 1.2. It's a little bit too much, but you can see the effect of it now. The water appears a lot more realistic. And our default value that I'm going to use is 1.05. You now have refraction added in as part of your water material. So as far as the actual water material, we are pretty much done. Now there are a few more things that I want to show you how to add on top, And there's going to be a few values right here for phase G, as well as color scale behind water. These two you may find helpful, although you don't need it. It may help you to add something into it, and it will change the look and the feel of the water in your level. As well as another parameter that I want to show you, kind of artistic value. You can change the base color to amplify the additional colors that you already have in your material. You do not need this as well, but you may want to experiment with having a constant 3 vector inside the base color to add that extra amplification of more color into your water. Before I show you these 3 values, as well as some issues with the directional light when you are outside with the directional light shining on your water plane, we need to deal with water plane itself. So select the water plane inside your level, and there are 2 values you want to make sure that you disable. So first of all, we have collisions on here. So if I spawn, I'm walking on top of the water. So we need to disable collisions for it so we can walk underneath and through. Select the water plane and search for collisions. And under collision preset, choose to no collision. Now if I spawn, I'm able to walk through the water and underneath it. Now when you are below the surface of the water, since this is a flat plane, you're not going to see anything. So for that, you would need a post-process volume to be inserted and then modify the properties of it so you have a different look and feel underneath it. So it would look like and feel like you are underwater. And you would just insert a post-process volume under visual effects. Drag it inside your level, place it below where the water is, and then you would adjust many properties inside the details panel to change the color, to change how every single one of these values would look when you enter this volume and you are inside it. So you could do that on your own to change how underneath the water would look. And one more thing for the water plane, you want to select it and search for cast shadow. And you want to disable cast shadow on this plane. Now it works without you having to disable it. You're not going to see much of a difference, but you may notice a slight change right here in the corners that there is a slight shadow that's being cast below this plane, usually very noticeable on the corners next to other objects. So if I disable this, depending on the color of the water, you may see more of a jump, of a change. In my case, I didn't really see much of a difference, but you do want to disable cast shadow on the water plane, and you do not need to have this value on, and I recommend you switch it off to avoid any issues. Then let's take a look at the constant 3 vector and see what that would do. So right now, if you use this value of 0 for base color, you don't need to do anything else. This will work and that's all you need. However, if you wanted to experiment, insert a constant 3 vector. Let's change this to a parameter and name it base color. Let's plug this in. Let's hit apply and take a look inside the level. So right now we see no changes, but if we bring this in, and let me make this screen bigger, and let's change the base color. So once you begin to add additional color into your level, you can see you can amplify and add a bit more artistic control by adding the base color into your water. So you have controls now for water color, for the surface of the water, water scattering depth color, as well as the base color you can adjust. You can play around with this to see what kind of results you get. I'm not going to use this, but that's something that you could play around with and experiment. Let me go ahead and replug this back in. The next 2 values are going to be right here inside the single layer water material node, and it's phase G and color scale behind water. So phase G is how much light scatters in the water relative to the direction of the sun. And color scale behind water increases luminance of the surface below the water and controls how bright or dark the shadows are below the water surface. So for these 2 values, we're going to use constant 1 vectors as parameters or scalar parameters, and we're going to actually take the plane outside so we can see more of these effects take place. Again, for the water that we currently have, you do not need these 2 values, but you may want to experiment to see what they do, as they allow you to have a little bit more control over your water, especially if you're going to be using this water for outside scenes with the directional light. So let's go ahead and insert 2 scalar parameters and name first one phase G, and now let me duplicate this, and this one will be color scale behind water, and we're going to keep the default values at 0. Let me go ahead and plug them in, phase G, and this one will go into color scale behind water. Let's hit apply. You can see the water already has changed. Let me go ahead and grab this water. I'm going to drag it outside, make a duplicate of it, just place it right here, and then just scale the water up so it's a larger, bigger plane. Alright, here we are. So I'm gonna disable those 2 values right now and just disconnect them at the moment just to see what the plane looked like before. Let me hit apply. So here's what the water would look like without those 2 values connected, because it does change the result of the water right away. And then here they are connected back with a value of 0 for both. Now let's go ahead and enable first is the phase G, which is again how much light scatters in the water relative to the direction of the sun. So when I begin to change it, you can see the amount of scattering that takes place. So if I increase it, if I bring it back down to 0, or I can go in the negative value. So you have this control of the amount of light that scatters. Let me insert a cube on top. I'm going to use just a simple cube. So this way we have something that's in the water and then also above water, so we can see the object being immersed into water as well as above water. Let me grab the shape and just insert a cube right here and make it larger, like so. And also let's take the water plane and lower it just slightly right there. And I'm going to bring this up. So this way we can test and see more of the effect. So just by increasing and decreasing, you can see how much it changes the water by scattering that light from the directional light. Let's go ahead and reset it. And then next one is color scale behind water, which is again, it increases luminance of the surface below the water. So if we increase it, you can see that it kind of amplifies and increases the luminance, the brightness. And let me turn on real time. So here's the value higher, and then I can push it up and you can see how much it changes when it's around objects as well as below the surface of the water. And let me increase the waves so they're not so still. Let's do 0.5, like so. So by increasing the color behind scale water, you can see increases the luminance, or I can push it down. And this is more for caustics when you are seeing the waves and the ripples, and it kind of changes the effect by brightening or darkening that caustics, that luminance below the water surface. Again, this is only for the surface of the water, nothing happens below it because we don't have anything below it, it's just a simple plane. But these two values just allow you to have more control, especially for exterior scenes when you have a directional light shining on the water. And by playing with these two, you can control the amount for both. So this is something you may want to add if you're going to be using this for outside scenes, for exteriors. But when it comes to the interiors, you could also use it and just control it and adjust it. But I usually, for this pool scene and for the pool water and the still water for interiors, I found myself not using these two. And I did not plug them in and I'm not using them. So this is something you may want to experiment for these two. Maybe have them, maybe not. Just play around with this and add on if you need it. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and delete it because I like using the water for the pool water as is without those two values available to me. And one last thing before we finish with the video, I want to show you a problem using the single layer water shader and having with the directional light in the outside scenes. You can see that it's whenever you have an object, it's casting a very hard shadow on top of the water plane. And you're going to have this problem across many of the objects. So the directional light, the way that it interacts currently with the water plane, there is a limitation of that directional light, and it's a directional light and the water shader, how they work together. That's the problem. And you can see that it's causing a very harsh shadow being cast on top of the water plane. And it should not happen. We should be able to see right through it, and we should not have to see the shadow being cast on top of the water. It should be translucent. And again, this is only a directional light water shader, single layer water shader problem. Whenever you have any other lights such as these interior lights, you're not going to have this issue. So if I drag the cube, it's going to work exactly how you would expect it to, like so. You're not going to have that harsh shadow when you have your interior lights. It's just that directional light. So there are workarounds to fix this. One of the most common ones is use ray trace shadows with your directional light. I do have a longer video that goes into different solutions on how to deal with this. But right now in this video, if you select your directional light and search for cast ray trace shadows and choose enabled, it's going to fix that issue. Now that's one of the solutions, and you may not want to have ray trace shadows on in your project. So there are a few other solutions, and I recommend you check out a longer video that goes into the problem and different solutions, depending if you want to use ray trace shadows or you don't want to use them and you want to use another solution to fix this. So with that, I hope you found this video very helpful. You learned a lot, and I will see you in the next one.